Hi, and welcome. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's my question for today. Why do people do what they do? It's a big question, I know, and it's one that's on the mind of our conversation partner in this episode. Today we're speaking to Steven Fuller, a professor of communication at the University of Cincinnati, and in addition to teaching communication, he has also written a book called The Church Experiment. A spiritual seeker visits 52 religious gatherings in 52 weeks. He's created a game called Good versus Gooder. And he is the host of the Communication Junkie podcast. In this conversation, you'll hear him describe what he calls his obsession with communication as being rooted in this question of why do people do what they do? And you'll hear him answer this for himself a little too, as far as sharing some stories from his childhood that help him to understand why he does the things that he does today. So knowing that the question I'm using to frame today's conversation is one that has many answers, or no answers depending on how you look at it, I guess I just intend for it to still spark some reflection and curiosity for us today about ourselves and why we do the things that we do, and about the others in our lives and in our worlds. Why do they do the things that they do? And if we can spend some time exploring that question, whether we think there's a concrete answer or not, that might help us have some more empathy and more understanding and be able to extend more curiosity to people. So, why do people do what they do? We may never know, but let's still spend some time thinking about it. And let's jump into our conversation with Steven. Hi, Steven. Thanks so much for being here today.
Hi, Abbie. Thanks for having me.
I'm really looking forward to getting into this conversation with you. I mean, it is a communication podcast, but not everyone that I get to talk to is a lover of communication in the way that I am, but I think we have some shared passion. So I'm excited to see where our conversation takes us today. And the more I've learned about you, you seem a very fascinating person. So I'm excited to hear more of your thoughts and ideas. But to start, of course, context is great. And so I wonder if you could share some stories with us that you feel are helpful to know going into this conversation that help us to understand who you are.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to it. I mentioned to you through an email, I listened to some of your episodes and you do a great job, and it's a really fun listen. So I'll try to live up to the expectations that I've heard previously. So my stories are a little boring in some ways. I think especially my childhood growing up, which I also think probably shaped me the way that it did. I grew up in a pretty utopian world. Now, looking back, obviously, it's, the neighborhood I grew up in wasn't amazing and our house wasn't amazing. But as a little kid, you don't really pay attention to that stuff.
Yeah.
All you really pay attention to was I had two parents that loved me. I had an older brother that I hung out with, an older sister that she was out of the house at a pretty early age for me, but then she had kids. And so they almost grew up like my siblings too. And so for me growing up, it was a lot of that sort of story that you would see in a movie or a TV show where I played basketball in the driveway and we played wiffle ball in the front yard. And it was a little boring, but I also think it created in me this real desire and passion for community that I feel like has stayed with me pretty much my whole life. That even in the stories that I love, I don't know if you've ever heard of a genre called cozy, like cozy mysteries, cozy stories.
I haven't.
They're really made for like 80-year-old women. But
yeah. And you?
Yeah. The TV show Murder, She Wrote. Did you ever watch that? You ever heard of that?
Yeah.
Golden Girls. Do you know what that sitcom is?
Yeah.
So all of these shows that I would watch growing up with my grandma, and they all had this like sense of perfect community.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I feel like I've kind of sought my entire life, which is problematic, right? Because in the world, there really is no such thing. And so I think from a really young age, there was kind of this mentality put in me to seek out relationships and community, living spaces, work environments that felt perfect and idyllic.
Yeah.
If you launch into life with that mentality, you're going to learn pretty quickly that you're going to get disappointed a lot.
Yeah.
Growing up and even becoming an adult, I feel like I kind of go through this cycle of trying to create this perfect world, this perfect environment, and then it failing.
Mm-hmm.
And so you sort of have to start over again and try to create a new perfect world, perfect environment. In some ways, I think it's part of the reason why I got into teaching, because you get to start over every 15 weeks with a new class, new students. And I always find myself towards the end of a semester feeling like I'm the worst teacher in the world. I did a horrible job. I should give up teaching. And then it ends and you get to start over and redo your syllabus and start teaching again and try to make the next one perfect. And so I think that all kind of started for me when I was a little kid growing up and just seeking out that sort of same feeling I had as a little kid. Like, can I recreate this over and over and over again? And I don't think it's ever really worked.
Yeah.
But the never ending quest to find that is kind of what my life has sort of turned into.
Do you consider yourself a perfectionist?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it's a good thing that you're always wanting more and striving to do more and be better.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of ways, it's really unproductive. Like I do have this one story from when I was, I think I was in third grade, maybe. I turned in an assignment and the teacher gave it back to me and I got a perfect score. I was very happy about that as a perfectionist. And I think she might have put like a little check mark on the top of it. You know, like teachers would do, they put like a sticker or check mark or something. And I was so excited about my perfect score that I kept putting check marks on the paper. I was putting my own check marks on them. And by the end, I had covered the entire piece of paper in check marks to the point where you couldn't even recognize the assignment anymore. Yeah. And I remember at the end of doing that, I looked at it and I completely ruined it. Right. So I was so excited to go show my parents. I was so excited to go home, put it on the refrigerator. And because I got so excited at my perfection, I ruined the perfection.
Yeah.
And I tell that story to my friends and people all the time. And they're like, oh, that's you. Like this quest for perfection and trying to be so perfect all of the time that you end up ruining every good thing that you do in the process.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so I think my life is mostly that story over and over and over again in different context of wanting to do a good job because I'm a perfectionist. I normally do okay. And then not being able to accept what it is that I did. And so you keep going and keep going and keep going until you ruin it. You ruin the fun.
Yeah.
You take the enjoyment out of it. And yeah, so that seems to be a common theme in what I do.
Yeah, I relate to that as well, in terms of perfectionism and I would say in that same family control. And so getting into this podcast, among other things in my life, has been a really important lesson for me because a big part of CMM is this idea of like emergence and mystery. And that has never really come naturally to me. What I tend to go more towards is the making a plan or, trying to perfect whatever situation I'm in. And so I'm leaning into embracing emergence. I think the lesson for me has been, I can do things really well. I think I'm a capable person and a lot of my life has been based around achievement, based on school and other extracurricular things that I did. And I know that when I am in control of things, I could get pretty close to perfection sometimes in my own eyes. But also that really good things can happen when you let go of that and try to let some things emerge too, as far as like, even in these conversations, like I started out having conversations with people and I sent them a ton of questions in advance and then was really trying to stick to those because I thought, this will be the perfect conversation if we hit these points. And I didn't leave any room. That was my version of putting 100 check marks on the page and covering up what could have been really good on its own. By trying to overdo it a little bit, probably.
Do you know where that control comes from for you?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think that's what was modeled for me in my family, that there was a real value around being self-sufficient which again, it's like a balance. Like it's great to be self-sufficient. And how can you lean into like relying on others or leaning into the things that you're not in control of? And so, yeah, I think I was a high achiever in a lot of areas in school, and I really valued getting that praise. And so I just wanted to keep chasing that. And so for me, I know that that's where that definitely stems from. And one of the things that I've talked about before is that, just a little example of this is that, maybe someone in your life maybe you're walking out the door and your mom says to you, "Have a good day, sweetie." My dad is someone who would say, "Make it a great day." And so I just use that as a little example of that was kind of the theme of my childhood of like, you have control. So make your day, make your situation what you want it to be, which I think is a great message, but I really internalized that. And I think maybe went a little overboard with it instead of trying to find some balance in the things I can control and the things I couldn't.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that I talk about in my interpersonal class is there's this model from a sociologist named Larry Crabb that I've tweaked over the years, because his original model wasn't exactly this, but it's called the iceberg illustration. And he talks about how we have these experiences, we have these stories that kind of shape who we become. And then ultimately, all of those experiences eventually lead to a bunch of strategies. So things that we do, things that we say in order to make life work for us. And it's interesting because I use that to get students thinking about, like, what are your experiences? What are your stories that have shaped you? And then how has it affected the type of person you become, the type of communicator you are, the type of, the way that you behave. And so I always ask them to find these experiences from their youth that lead them down these pathways. And so even going into this interview, I was thinking a little bit more specifically about kind of what those experiences and stories were for me. And as I was thinking about those, like I was thinking about that kind of idyllic childhood. And for sure, one of the big experiences for me that led me into being a control freak was switching schools when I was in sixth grade, right in the middle of a school year, which I don't know if you remember junior high, but it's miserable to begin with. And then I left right in the middle of sixth grade, had to start a new school, moved from Cincinnati to Louisiana. So it's a completely different culture. And I'll never forget that first day of school, going to the cafeteria and having no one to sit with. That feeling of being out of control. I didn't know what to do. I was a shy kid. I could have gone and sat with someone, but then you risk rejection. I could sit by myself, but then people think you're a loser. And so I sat down for like 30 seconds, shoveled in some food, got up, threw my tray away, went to the bathroom and just sat in the bathroom for the rest of lunch. And I still, to this day, when I'm in situations like that, when I don't know people and other people know each other, I'll still, 30 plus years later, still have that same feeling in my stomach of being out of control, people thinking I'm weird, people thinking I'm a loser. And so I always tell my students, it's when you look at my life now, again, 30 plus years later, what you see throughout my entire life is a person who tries to put themselves in places where they're in control of that situation. Again, going back to the childhood, almost everything I do is trying to find a community in which I can be in charge of that community. And then while I'm in charge of that community, ultimately being such a control freak that I ruin it. And so then I have to go start over somewhere else and do it all over again. And, that I think just from a few little experiences from my childhood set me down this path to playing out this same cycle kind of over and over and over again.
Absolutely.
So I do think those, especially those early stories, experiences that we have, the stories that we tell ourselves about those experiences, they shape us forever. It's
interesting to think about those stories from a lens of control, because when you're young, you don't have a lot of control or agency over the messages that are being passed on to you or the things that are happening to you or what you're internalizing. You're not using critical thinking because you don't have critical thinking yet in a lot of ways to be able to, in those moments, decide what you want to internalize and what you don't. It's only kind of retroactively, and so it is interesting. And I was laughing, not because laughing at you, but laughing at me because you're speaking to me and my experience too about a real need to make myself a core member of different communities so that I don't feel like I'm on the edge. And I worked as an RA at my college. And there was one moment where I think my boss had to pull me aside and was like, you expect a lot of people. And I was like, I do. But she was kind of saying it in they don't know if they can, like, I was bringing this perfectionist energy to everybody else.
Right. Because you expect a lot of yourself. And so
exactly.
Why can't these people keep up with me in this situation? And yeah, I mean, I always joke with my students, it's the reason I'm standing up here in front of you is because you have to pay attention to me. Like there's no moment where I walk in and you choose whether or not I'm part of the group or not.
Yep.
Like I am the group. And so you have to like me. You have to pay attention to me. You have to laugh at my jokes. And, and again, I'm not proud of being a perfectionist. I'm not proud of the neediness that comes with all of that. But I do think it certainly makes sense if you think back to some of the experiences and stories from my youth, for sure.
Yeah. Steven, I'd love to hear more about what your journey into communication has been, because I know it's so meaningful for me to get to study it in my undergraduate, and I'm planning on, continuing and getting a master's, and I could see myself as a teacher one day. And so I'm always curious about people's journeys into it and what the process has looked like for you, what it's like to be on the other side of it now and be a teacher, and what it means to you or how it affects you to be immersed in the world of communication.
Yeah. So I think that energy stayed with me. There was always sort of, as a kid, I was just curious about a lot of things. And I loved mystery. I loved the idea that there's all this stuff out there that we can't explain, that we're trying to figure out at all times. And this goes probably a little bit farther back than what you want. But
no, please.
When I was 7-ish years old, I remember becoming obsessed with whether or not Santa Claus was real or not. And so, spoiler alert, in case there's any 8-year-olds listening to the podcast, but I was obsessed with it. One Christmas, I remember leaving out an audio recorder. Back in those days, it was like a little cassette recorder, whatever. And I left it out because I was trying to catch Santa, saying something. And I think it was my brother or somebody went out in the middle of the night and went ho, ho, ho on the recorder. And so I thought I caught actual audio of Santa Claus. I know it all seems cruel now looking back, but I did research on it. One of the funniest things looking back was I had this Christmas book and I found this, Yes, Virginia, There Is a Santa Claus story letter. I don't know if you ever read that, but someone wrote into a newspaper asking if there was a Santa Claus, back in the 50s or 60s or whatever. And somebody wrote an article back saying, yes, there is a Santa Claus, and gave all these reasons. And I found this and I read it. And I remember going to my mom and saying, I found it. This is the evidence I've been looking for. This newspaper writer. Yeah. Prove there's a Santa Claus. Yeah. The original fake media, I guess. So I was so excited about that. And I remember the day I found out that he wasn't. I wasn't, destroyed or anything, because I think kids figure out and adapt. But I just remember the obsession with figuring it out.
Yeah.
I feel like that became a big theme in my life, where I've just obsessed with mystery and obsessed with figuring things out. And as I aged, the mysteries just became different. Obviously, it wasn't Santa Claus anymore, but, I got obsessed as a teenager with, how do you choose one person to marry? How do you, out of all these people on the planet, how does this even happen? Picking one person and then doing that for the rest of your life. Relationships to me became this huge mystery. It's how do you get into one? How do you do that forever? How do you choose somebody? And so I think a lot of my early obsession with communication was this obsession with relationships. what are they? I mean, again, when you're a teenager, it's also like, you want to date people. Like you're trying to figure out like how to get a girlfriend, how to get a boyfriend, all that stuff. And so I remember going to college, and my original major was psychology, which tracks.
Yeah.
But you get into psychology and it's just not what I thought it was going to be. It wasn't all that interesting to me. And so I changed to accounting, which is odd, but I was always good at math, which I might be the only communication person on the planet who was.
You might, yeah.
And I got into accounting. I was like, well, this is boring. Like I'm never going to get into a relationship if I'm an accountant. And that was one of the big keys at the time. And so I took interpersonal communication, and suddenly it was like, oh, this is the map. This is like the decoder ring for answering all of these questions you have. Why do people get into relationships? How do they get into relationships? How do they make relationships last? And beyond that, just why do people say the stuff that they do? Why do people do the stuff they do? I was obsessed at a pretty young age with people and how weird we all are. I would have this job. I worked downtown a little bit while I was in college in Cincinnati, and on my lunch break, I would go out and I would sit on our main Fountain Square area out there, and I would just watch people. And not in like some weird way, just being like, who are these people? Like, what are they doing? Like, what are their lives like? I had an apartment in a particular community in Cincinnati back then where I could see the river, and there's a bridge that crosses the Ohio River from Kentucky into Cincinnati. And I would just watch cars go over that bridge, and I would think to myself, like, who is in that car? Like, they have an entire life. Like they're going somewhere and they're doing something, and their life to them is just as important and dramatic and interesting as my life is to me. And it was just car after car after car. And I took that obsession, and every communication class I took, it was like a little bit more of the answer to those questions. And so I kind of got hooked pretty quickly. It's a little like psychology. It's a little like sociology. It's a little like anthropology, but communication just approaches those big questions from this different angle that really resonated with me. Like really studying the things people say and the way they say them and the things they do and why they do them. It was all just really fascinating to me.
Just in the interest of understanding your relationship to communication a little more, I'm just curious about the language that you're using. If there's a reason that you say, call this an obsession instead of like an interest or a passion.
Yeah, well, I can be obsessive about things. I use that word a lot. And so obsessive compulsive disorder is an actual condition that, requires a diagnosis. And so I never say I'm OCD because I think we need to be careful of terminology we use.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely a very obsessive person. I can get ideas in my head and thoughts in my head, and it's really challenging for me to let go of those. I have some anxiety stuff that's mostly centered around health anxiety. And part of the reason why I deal with that is because if I have like an ache or a pain or something, I start to obsess over it.
Yeah.
And I'll think I'm having a heart attack. I'm thinking like pandemics are really fun when you have health anxiety. It's, yeah. Every time you feel a little warm, you're like, oh, I have COVID. And so that obsession plays out in different parts of my life. I can get obsessed about like sports or obsessed about a particular band or whatever.
Yeah.
And so for me, it really was almost like this endless obsession with why are people the way they are, and why do they say the things they do, and why do they do the things they do? And I think about it all of the time.
Yeah.
if I go out to dinner and I'm with someone, I'm a pretty decent communicator because I know all of this stuff. And so I try really hard to focus. But if there's a conversation at the table next to me that is interesting, I have no chance. Like, I have to eavesdrop on that conversation.
Yeah.
My favorite moments in life are when I'm at Starbucks and at the table next to me, there's two people breaking up or whatever. Like, those are the moments that are on a first date. Boy, that's like hitting the jackpot. Just listening to the way people communicate on first dates, like the things that they talk about, like the questions they ask. Like, I love it. And so any situation like that in the real world with real people living real life, like, I just want every bit of that I can get.
Yeah.
Which sadly is part of the reason why I kind of like reality TV shows.
Sure.
Even though it's all kind of fake and scripted, like, there's still something about you get to eavesdrop on these people's supposedly private moments.
Yeah, right.
And even though it is scripted and there's cameras there, I do think human behavior kind of takes over at times, and you get to see real reactions from real people, which I've always found interesting.
Yeah, it is. And I relate to a lot of what you say about why communication felt so interesting to you is that, I think the reason for me personally why I couldn't be like an accountant or have studied accounting in school is that I loved the fact that I went into my classes, learned things, and then went out into my life and actually used them. I saw my relationships change, and I saw the way that I was showing up change because of what I was learning. Do you have any stories or memories like that of your time as a student when you were learning something and were actually able to also use it? This is what I love, because I love thinking about how communication theory can actually become practical for people in our lives, because I've seen it in my life. And so I want to know about it in other people's lives too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's going back a ways, thinking about my student days in college and specifically how that affected me. I think overall it was what you're saying is, there's a lot of stuff that happens in college that is really meaningful, but you have a hard time connecting the dots of why this matters or when I'm going to use this. I mean, it's sort of it's again, I like math. Math is good. We need math. But it's sort of that old joke about like calculus, or unless you're really going into fields that you have to know how to do these math equations in order to build bridges or whatever it is that you're doing. Like, practically day to day, it's really hard to connect those dots.
Right. And
my communication classes, it was just one day after another. It was like, oh my gosh, that just happened to me last week. Or again, romantic relationships have always fascinated me, which is part of the reason why I like interpersonal communication. Day-to-day relationship stuff where you get into a fight with someone and you don't understand why it happened the way that it did. And then you go to class the next day and the teacher's like, oh, and here's the reason why this happens when we argue with people. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what happened last night. I remember this communication researcher named Jon Stewart, who, not the host of The Daily Show, a different Jon Stewart. And I remember reading an article of his forever ago where he talked about this concept called nexting, Nexting. And I'd never seen it anywhere else. And maybe he just sort of made it up on the fly in this article that he wrote. But the whole idea is that the next thing that happens in communication is the most important thing in the communication. And I remember thinking about that in terms of like an argument, and how there's so many times in relationships where you're in an argument and you kind of have two things going on. Like, you have your calm, rational thoughts that are telling you what you should say. Because if I say this thing, it will diffuse the argument. If I just stop and say, sweetie, like, I love you, let's take a deep breath. If you just do that, you can diffuse it. But then there's that other part of you that wants to say the thing that is going to piss them off more than anything else and push their buttons and make them feel bad, and so just that concept of nexting, it's like, if I can learn how to right the ship in the moment and say the healthy, productive thing, it doesn't matter what the previous hour looked like.
Mm-hmm.
That next sentence is the most important sentence in this communication episode. And it just, little things like that just kept showing up over and over and over again, that felt like this matters. Like, this will actually make my life better. This will make my relationships better. It'll make my work better. It'll make school better. It'll make my entire life better. Again, I'm not saying that's exclusive to communication. Mm-hmm. I've had that happen in many other classes and many other subjects back when I was in school, but it certainly felt like it happened a lot in communication, and it felt meaningful to me. And then ultimately, when it came to teaching, it felt like this would be a meaningful thing to do, to share with other people.
Yeah. Do you see maybe some of that same passion in your students now that you're a teacher?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I definitely think there are those light bulb moments, which are the kind of those fun moments when you're telling a story or giving an example, and you can see people be like, oh yeah, that's, I always say communication is one of those subjects where you think you know everything, but you don't really know it until someone says it out loud. Mm-hmm. It's like every time you hear someone say something, you're like, oh yeah, that's obvious.
Yeah,
I knew that. Well, it's like, well, why didn't you do it? And it's like, well, I didn't really think of it that way until you just said it. Like, it all seems intuitive, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it all seems obvious that when we're having a fight with someone, we shouldn't push their buttons. We should say something loving to diffuse the situation. Well, that's obvious. Well, then why doesn't anybody do it? Mm-hmm. And so just putting names to some of those things that people sort of intuitively feel but don't know how to communicate or don't know how to do, and then giving some tools to help people do those things, that's a pretty rewarding job. I don't know many subject areas that give you that sense of you're actually helping people's day-to-day lives than communication. And, I've gotten the emails over the years of students reaching out and sharing some personal anecdotes, which is great. Mm-hmm. One of the most interesting ones I ever received was a woman sent me an email saying that after taking my class, she decided to divorce her husband. Whoa. Which, that one was a little intense. I was like, oh boy, I'm not sure that's what I was going for, but okay. I mean, mm-hmm. hopefully that was the right decision, and she's living happily ever after now. But I do think that's kind of the weight of, like, we're talking about people's relationships here. We're talking about what type of parent they might be someday. We're talking about whether or not they're going to have a successful career. The communication is one of those fields that everyone's like, oh yeah, communication, I know how to communicate. And it's like, yeah, you do, but you're not very good at it. Yeah. And so there are some things you can learn that could potentially make your life a little bit better than what it might be otherwise.
I feel so strongly about that exact point of, I think at my university, and I think a lot, it was required that every single student in the university take one comm class, and that was the public speaking class. But I'm sitting in my interpersonal communication class being like, this is the one everybody should be taking, because unless you major in communication or, devote your academic life to studying that, you don't get access to all these ideas in high school, elementary school. We don't teach it like we teach math and science. I think it's ridiculous to assume that people will just stumble into effective communication. And I think that's probably representative of a culture that's valued different things and hasn't. And, I guess in general, it is true that the study of communication is a younger field compared to others. And so maybe that has to do with it. But I just think it's so important. And there are real tools and language, like you were saying, and skills that people can arguably easily learn and then translate into their own actual lives and actual relationships to make their actual lives better. But it's almost gate kept in a way in academia. And that's where I feel passionate about, of having a hand in each of like the side of academia and then bringing that out into this like real world to say, how do we turn this theory into practice and how do we make it more accessible so that it's not just the people that devote their lives to studying communication that get to know all this stuff and use it in their lives.
Yeah, for sure. We had, I don't know, 7-8 years ago, the IT department in our university decided they were going to start requiring interpersonal communication. So all of the students who are getting degrees in IT started to come into our classes. And the way that we do interpersonal is there's about 75 students per class. So we started getting, out of those 75, half of the classes were IT students at one point, and it changed the dynamic of the classroom. And one of the reasons why it changed the dynamic is because their attitude going in is very often, why am I in this class? Like, I just want to be working with computers and figuring out IT stuff. And there's this attitude of like, this isn't important. This doesn't matter. And it really is interesting to watch sort of the evolution throughout the 15 weeks of, now some of them at the very end are still like, I don't care, but the majority of them kind of that light bulb going off and them starting to understand why this matters. And what I tell everybody is, look, you can major in whatever you want. Great. Not everyone should be a communication major. We need more things in the world than just communication majors, but you better get a minor or a certificate or take a couple classes. You better do something in communication because you're going to get your IT degree and you're going to go into IT field and you're going to be able to do all the technical parts of that. But when you get raises and promotions, and it's not going to be because you're really great at the technical side. It's going to be because you can communicate, you can problem solve, you can manage conflict, you're a good leader, like all of these skills, you're a good listener that you learn in the communication field complement anything that you're going to be doing. It's one of the reasons why health communication is becoming more and more popular. It's because, look, if you've ever gone to a doctor, if you've ever been in the hospital, it's a mess. Like, I mean, even going through the pandemic, and it's like people trying to communicate about health with vaccines and masks, and it is so chaotic that if you can be in that field and communicate well, you're going to be a superstar. And our world desperately needs people that can communicate effectively about health and the environment and all of these issues that are life and death for all of us. You have to be able to marry the science and the ability to be able to communicate that science if you want to be effective. And so, I think all of us, in whatever it is that we do, communication is a huge part of that.
It's interesting that the selling point is oftentimes, this makes you more marketable, or, this will help you in your profession in whatever way. But also I'm like, you should just want to be able to have these tools to show up to any of your relationships, whether it's going to result in you getting a raise or not, but just to have these like quality relationships in your life that are going to, contribute to having a better quality of life in general. And again, I think it's people just take for granted that they know how they're an okay communicator, because we all do learn things about communication outside the classroom. Whether we learn about effective communication or not is the question. But I think that's a big thing that people take for granted. But for me, why communication was so easy almost to grasp is what you were saying earlier, is I wasn't really learning anything I didn't already know. What I was learning was new language for what I had already experienced. But in a lot of my communication classes, it was, I almost immediately know what you're talking about because I've experienced that, because a lot of people have experienced this or experience this daily in our relationships, in our lives. I just didn't have the language for it. And I've said before in a podcast, like, if you don't have the language to talk about your experience, then you don't talk about your experience. And that's why it felt empowering is the word that I use, because I think having language is empowering. It has been for a number of, I would say, like minority groups to have this language around their experience that they haven't before. It's like, I don't know. I've heard people say, like, why is everyone gay all of a sudden? Or why is everyone a feminist all of a sudden? It's like, no, we just have language where we didn't have language before. And so that's why you're maybe hearing about it more, because people are getting to talk about something that they've already experienced, but now have the language for.
Yeah, for sure. And this is something that throughout time, there's this project years ago that I discovered that was called Photo Voice. And it was, you go into communities where people don't necessarily have the platforms to be able to speak about their experiences. And so you give them cameras and they take photographs of their experience. And that's how they communicate sort of their lived experiences through these photographs that they take. That's the power of communication, right? Is that, to your point, you have a very small group of people on this planet that have had a voice for almost the entire existence of human society. And when one group has that platform, that group gets really good at communicating their wants, their needs, their pains, the atrocities committed against them. And other groups don't. They don't have the language, they don't have the opportunities. And so I don't think it's any coincidence that the reason why we've seen so many oppressed groups suddenly in the past couple decades finding a voice and finding opportunities to create equality is because we have all of these communication tools now, from social media to on and on and on. Mm-hmm. And so, this makes a lot of sense, right? That if we can train people how to be better communicators, more effective communicators, and give them platforms to communicate, and we get to hear people's experiences, and they have opportunities to talk about what they need, what they desire, their hopes, their dreams, that should create a more equal, diverse, inclusive world. Now, again, everyone who doesn't want that then uses those same platforms to fight back. Thus begins kind of the battle. But step one is you have to be able to start giving a voice to people that haven't had a voice. And communication does that in a million different ways. And so, there's a lot of power in communication. And I think it's one of the reasons why our major is one of the driving forces in a lot of the conversations that we've had. A lot of our scholars are leading the way in these conversations. A lot of my colleagues are doing amazing research in these areas. And, communication is a huge platform to be able to do that.
Okay, that is all for part 1 of our conversation with Steven, but we will be back next Monday for part 2, and you can join us in that conversation. In the meantime, I'd ask you to think about the 3 questions that I have in the description of today's episode. And they are, why do people do what they do, like we talked about at the beginning of the episode, but also, how can better communication practices help you in your work life and in your personal relationships? And finally, how can you help make your community one where people feel empowered to share their stories? I'm always talking about using a communication lens, and I think that's a great way to approach these questions, and will hopefully make more sense to you after hearing Steven and I's conversation today about what it looks like to use a communication lens, is to understand how communication practices shape our relationships and the choices we make and the way that we interact with the world. And clearly, Steven and I believe that taking a communication perspective is something that can enrich your experience of the world, and maybe you'll find that to be true for you as well. Okay, so join us next week. We'll be back with part 2. As always, I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of the many initiatives that the CMM Institute has created, all with the interest of creating those better social worlds. And like we talked about in the episode with Steven today, making these communication tools and language and theories more accessible to people. Of course, a good podcast next turn is always to share an episode that was meaningful to you with a friend, either this episode if it really spoke to you, or maybe take some time to reflect on what other episodes have been meaningful for you. Go back and listen to them yourself, share them with people that you want to bring into the conversation. It's so important that we keep inviting people into this conversation so that it can just become more and more expansive, and so more and more people can benefit from these conversations and the tools that we are working on cultivating here. Thank you for showing up today. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.